that we can now influence people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on our understanding of who they are, observing their data. And we know, and this is now years and years of research, that the predictions that algorithms can make about us based on these traces are really accurate. So what we know is that they're oftentimes much better than the insights than even our closest friends and partners have, and sometimes even better than our own insights at predicting future behavior and how we're going to make choices and decisions in the future. So the ability to understand people's needs, preferences through algorithms and data, coupled with the ability to then influence their behavior, is this something that benefits us or potentially hurts us? And so for me, it's really one of these instances where I think it's regulation in combination with technology that's going to make a real difference when it comes to protecting people's privacy and preventing the abuse. It is also a privileged position because not everybody feels comfortable sharing their data. So collectively, I think we should be standing up.
皆さんこんにちは。NTT データ経営研究所とフォーティエンスの社長をしています山口です。今日はコロンビア大学のサンドラ・マッツ教授にインタビューいたしましたので、紹介したいと思います。サンドラ・マッツ教授はMINDMASTERSという本の中でビッグデータを分析すると人間の性格であります開放性とか誠実性、外交性、協調性、神経症的傾向のこの5つの基本属性で人間の性格が分類されるんですが、そのビッグデータから分析するとほぼこれを当てることができるということを本の中でまずは書いておられます。でそういう事例も含めてこの本の中には書いてありますが、もう一点最近の論文ではですね、この人の性格、先ほど申しました5つの性格に合った文章を作っていくと人間の行動変容に大変大きなインパクトを与えるという論文を書かれております。例えばこの開放性の高い人には、例えば新しい iPhone が出た時にどういうメッセージを送ればこの人の購買意欲が上がるかということで、例えば例としてパーティーの中でこれをこの最新の iPhone を見せれば皆さんの注目の的になりますよと、だから買ったらいいですよというようなメッセージを送るとかなり購買率が上がるというような実験を紹介されております。というように今回は生成 AI がさらに進んできた中で心理学と生成 AI または AI の関係がどうなっていくかということについて、先生の方にインタビューいたしました。大変このホットなテーマで今後AI とどう付き合っていくか、 AI は人間の心理まである部分を読み始めた、こういうところにどう対応していくかということを考えるためにも大変有効なインタビューになったかと思っております。インタビューを見ていただければ幸いでございます。よろしくお願いいたします。First, the core ideas in MINDMASTERS. Secondly, how generative models turn these insights into personalized perception. Then, we bring these perspectives together and see where our approach aligns, where it diverges. Connect psychological insight with a generative AI in a way that produces measurable impact while keeping governance at the center. The ambition is not persuasion for its own sake. It is creating value that respects people's autonomy and improves their decisions. We first met in May at Colombia, discussing your book and its relevance for Japan. That conversation convinced me that your work offers a perspective our audience truly need. Professor Matt is one of the leading voices in understanding how digital behavior reveals human psychology and how that insight can be used responsibly. Sandra, may I invite you to introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you so much for having me. And I very much look forward to the conversation. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had here at Columbia. And I'm really looking forward to continuing it in this format. So, my name is Sandra Matz. I'm a computational social scientist. So, I work at the intersection of psychology, computer science, and business. And I'm a faculty at Columbia Business School. I'm really excited to share insights from my book with you.
Let's move into the first part of our dialogue, MINDMASTERS. What impressed me most in the book is how clearly it shows that digital traces are not just data, but windows into human psychology, revealing personality, values, and even momentary states. The combination of the Big Five framework with large-scale, real-world data makes these insights both rigorous and actionable. With that, Sandra, may I invite you to walk us through the core ideas of MINDMASTERS and share your perspective with our audience?
Thank you so much for the invitation to share the insights of MindMasters with the audience. So I already mentioned that my background is in psychology and computer science, and I consider these two worlds almost antagonistic on the surface. You have the world of human desires, needs, preferences, motivations on the one hand, and then you have the somewhat cold and structured world of math, algorithms, and increasingly AI on the other. And my work for the last 10, 15 years now as a computational social scientist has been focused on integrating those two worlds, really trying to understand human behavior from a computational point of view. And the reason for why I decided to write MindMasters and to really talk about this work that I've been doing for the last 15 years is that I wanted to bring out the human side of data. Oftentimes when we talk about AI, we talk about data, it can feel really artificial, mechanistic, but oftentimes the data is being produced by people and should work for people. So that's the essence of what I wanted to capture in MindMasters. And what I do in the book is that I relate my work at this intersection of psychology and computer science to my own experience of growing up in a very small village in the southwest corner of Germany, population 500 people. That's where I grew up. And my experience there was very much shaped by the other 499 people living in that village. Because what those neighbors had access to was really every detail of my life. They knew what I was doing on the weekend. They knew who I was dating. They knew what I was hoping to do after finishing high school. And for me, back in the day, growing up, that meant two things. The first one is that it was an incredibly community to support me whenever I needed them. When it was asking for advice for careers, they were there because they understood what I needed and what I wanted to get out of life. But it also at the same time meant that there were people interfering with my life in ways that I didn't always have full control over and didn't always appreciate because it felt like it was happening behind my back without me really being in charge of my own decisions. Now, I don't live in this village anymore. I am a professor at Columbia University in New York now, where I live with my family. But what I would argue and what I argue in the book is that in a way, we all live in a digital village today. So today, it's no longer our neighbors that observe every action that we take, every decision that we make, but it's our interactions with technology. It's what we post on social media. It's our credit card swipes. It's the censored data that gets captured by our smartphones. It's the fact that we invite these smart devices into our homes, that there's someone who is looking over our shoulder, capturing the decisions, our choices, our behaviors pretty much continuously and without us necessarily being always aware. And what I've been studying for the past 15 years is this concept that I call psychological targeting. It's analogous to my experience in the village, this idea that we can now influence people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on our understanding of who they are, observing their data. And I'll explain more about this as we go through the presentation. But essentially, the way that the book is structured and the way that I've been thinking about this over the last 15 years falls into three broad buckets. The first chapter in the book is really all about how does AI translate all of the data that we generate as we interact with technology into these more meaningful insights about people's psychology. And that can range anywhere from people's personality traits, their personal values, mental health estimates. How do algorithms form these insights? Based on that understanding, I was really intrigued from the beginning of my career, the question of what does that mean? Once algorithms can learn who we are, what we need, what motivates us, what power does that give them? What power does that give them to influence our choices and our behavior? And then the last part really focuses on the question of how do we best navigate this landscape? How do we make sure that the extent to which algorithms can understand and influences actually works to the benefit of consumers and not just to the benefit of big corporations who can mine this data and influence behavior at scale. So starting with the how part, because that really is the foundation of everything that comes after. And the question here is, how do algorithms translate these data traces that we generate into more holistic profiles, a more holistic understanding of who the person is? And I'm not going to go into any of the details, any of the math, but I want to share some intuitions around this. And I want to start with like a simple experiment. So imagine that you've just been contacted by the FBI, and what they're looking for is a target. They're looking for a person that they've been searching for. And the only thing that they know about this person is that the person loves Hello Kitty. And now the question to you, if that was the only information that you had available, just imagine, conjure an image in your mind of who that person might be. Now, if you're like most other people, the image that comes to mind is a relatively young, most likely woman. That's like when you ask people, that's the image that comes to mind. And in a way, algorithms work in the same way. They typically try to observe a lot of data and then just say, okay, what is the sociodemographic, the psychological profile that shows up most frequently when we think of a certain digital trace, in this case, people who like Hello Kitty. Now, it turns out that in this case, the former world record holder of Hello Kitty memorabilia is actually a retired police officer in Japan. So those predictions are never perfect. They're never deterministic. They're always probabilistic, right? So if you know nothing about a person other than they like Hello Kitty, chances that it's a young female is actually quite high, but it's never fully deterministic. Now, the same way that you can be an FBI profiler and use Hello Kitty as a signal, algorithms can essentially take a look at all the data that we generate for thousands, sometimes millions of people, and see how those traces are related to their self-reported psychological traits. So some of the early research in the space was actually looking at language. So that was looking at the posts that people make on social media, in this case, Facebook. And it was relating the words that people use, the content that they talk about, the topics that they share, to, in this case, the personality trait of extroversion. So people who are extroverted, outgoing, they crave social stimulation. And you can see that this is reflected in the language that they use. So they talk about weekends, partying, all of the social things that you typically do with other people. If you contrast that to the language and the topics that are being discussed by people who are more introverted, quiet, and reserved, you can see the difference. So people who are introverted, they talk about things that you typically do by yourself, like reading, anime, internet, computers. You don't need other people to enjoy some of these activities. And for me, what I really like about this early work is it shows that it's not magic and it's not rocket science, because all the researchers here really did was count words. So they looked at how often do people talk about these words and how is that related to their psychological traits. And we can really discover some amazing insights into human psychology just by using these observational data. So my favorite scientific finding in the space is actually, again, looking at words. And I remember being at this conference, a room full of psychologists, and a speaker, Jamie Pennebaker, who was a leader in the world of natural language process in the context of psychology. He goes up on stage and he asks the audience, imagine I found this a really intriguing finding in my research. People who use first-person pronouns, so I, me, myself, references to the self, who use these words more often than other people, they have a very one thing in common. Guess what it is? And I remember everybody in the audience thought it was going to be narcissism. Everybody thought if people talk about themselves, they're probably more self-centered and narcissistic. It turns out that references to the self are actually a sign of emotional distress. So anxiety, depression, and this might sound surprising at first, but when you think about it for a second, it actually makes a lot of sense. If you take a step back and think back to the last time that you maybe felt blue, depressed, somewhat anxious, you were probably not thinking about solving the world's problems. What you were thinking about is, why am I feeling so bad? How do I get better? Am I ever going to get better? And this inner monologue, this focus on the self, just creeps into the language that we use when we communicate with other people, and increasingly on social media. So what we know is, and this is just one example or 4 examples from research that I've been doing over the last couple of years, which is 4 digital traces. So you have people spending money on pets, you have people who are interested in the luxury brand Prada, you have people who are interested in skydiving, and you have people whose phone is constantly running out of battery. And what you have this mapped against here is people's psychological traits. So we know that empirically speaking, and this is just what the data says, that it's not us imposing a theory onto the data, is that people who spend money on pets, statistically speaking, they're more kind, cooperative, caring, and trusting than other people, which makes sense. If you love to look after your furry friends, you probably have a more caring nature. Competitive people actually have a preference for the brand Prada, which, again, if you think about it, it's a status symbol, which means that people are oftentimes just more competitive in the way that they compare themselves with other people. Skydiving, you have to be somewhat emotionally stable to enjoy that activity. If you're easily stressed, very neurotic, very anxious, you probably don't enjoy jumping out of an airplane. So there, the causality goes in the opposite direction. And then the last example is one that I really like, which is people who are somewhat more disorganized than other people who are more conscientious. Their phones are more often running out of battery. And for me, the last one is one of these signals that we don't intentionally put out there to show the world who we are, right? We can say that social media is a very curated version of who we are and who we might want to be, but this is a signal that we just create without even thinking. And still it holds this very intimate insight into who we are as a person. And we know, and this is now years and years of research, that the predictions that algorithms can make about us based on these traces are really accurate. So what we know is that they're oftentimes much better than the insights that even our closest friends and partners have, and sometimes even better than our own insights at predicting future behavior and how we're going to make choices and decisions in the future. So those predictions are never perfect, which is important when we think about ethical implications, but they're really accurate and intimate. Now that leads me to the second part, the so what question. If we can predict these really intimate and private traits, states about people, what does it mean? Because in most cases, when you think about applications, the objective is not necessarily just understanding. The same way that back in the village where I grew up, my neighbors were not just in the business of trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted. They wanted to influence. They didn't just want to know who I was dating. They also wanted to influence who I was dating. So the same is true in the world of data. So the more that I understand where someone is coming from, what their needs are, their motivations are, the easier it is for me to actually influence their behavior. You just have to look at kids. kids are amazing at that. I have a 2-year-old boy, and he has already figured out how to ask me for the things that he wants in a very different way than he asks his dad. So we are so attuned to figuring out where the other side is coming from that we oftentimes don't even notice it in our offline conversations. But this principle also applies to the digital world. So this is one of the early studies that we did to demonstrate the power of psychological targeting, where we collaborated with a beauty retailer in the UK. And the objective was to get women to click on an ad on Facebook, go to the website and purchase something. And what we said is, why do women, or the question that we asked is, why do women buy beauty products? For all kinds of different reasons. So the more that you understand why a woman might be interested in buying beauty products, the more you can customize the message. So in this case, we divided the audience into women that we predicted to be more extroverted, so outgoing and social, and women that we predicted to be more introverted, so reserved and quiet. And then we worked with a beauty retailer's team to come up with messaging and advertising that was tailored to these psychological dimensions. So you could see the extroverted ad was always a woman like in a social setting. There were other people around. It was exciting and stimulating. The text said something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then the introverted ads would always be just one woman in a much more quiet and reserved setting. And the copy, the text said something like, beauty doesn't have to shout. So the same product, but framed in very different ways to meet the needs of these women in the different audiences. And what we saw with a very simple design was an uptake in 50% in the number of purchases. So again, a very simple manipulation kind of resulted in a pretty big difference when it comes to behavior. And very early on, that led me to the question that I'm sure we're going to continue to talk about is, should we be terrified or excited about this opportunity? So the ability to understand people's needs, preferences through algorithms and data, coupled with the ability to then influence their behavior, is this something that benefits us or potentially hurts us? And with every good scientific answer, the conclusion is both. And I think it's very obvious what the potential downsides are. So we've already mentioned this in the introduction. There's a clear risk to people's privacy, but also agency. So it's not just that someone can understand things about us that we don't necessarily want them to know, but also that by knowing these things about us, they can influence our decisions such that suddenly the choices we make are no longer our own. And you could argue that that might not be the end of the world if someone is selling you toothpaste that you otherwise didn't need. But you could also argue that it might be the end of the world if it's starting to influence elections, if it's starting to undermine democracy in political advertising, for example. So there are real risks associated with this type of psychological targeting. However, I also truly believe, and this is where I have spent a lot of the last couple of years trying to highlight the potential positive impact of this ability to understand and influence behavior. My probably favorite two examples are education. So I'm incredibly excited by the fact that my son is going to grow up in a world that looks very different to the world that I grew up in. When I grew up, there were 40 people in the classroom. The examples were the same for everybody. It doesn't matter if someone understands or stops understanding very early on. It doesn't matter if my son is interested in cars or unicorns. We all got the same examples and we all got the same education. With AI and technology, we can not only understand, well, how does a specific kid learn best, but we can then also customize the entire curriculum, the entire way that we go and teach kids to their specific needs. The same is true for mental health, which is another domain that I'm really interested in and that I'm really excited by when I think about the potential of AI, both when it comes to tracking mental health. So we know that most people never get diagnosed, and there's still an incredibly high number of suicides that could easily be prevented by diagnosing these mental health conditions much earlier. But there's also currently a huge gap in demand and supply when it comes to treatment. So if you look at the worldwide, for every 100,000 people who are looking to get mental health treatment, there are 13 human professionals. So most people, even when they get diagnosed, don't get the support that they need to get better. And we know that AI is just incredibly good at both delivering therapy and also customizing it to the personal needs. It's probably not going to replace human therapists anytime soon, but at least for the people who otherwise can't afford a human therapist or simply don't have access, I think there's an incredible opportunity to really move the needle. And that also brings me to the last part already, because if we truly believe that there is value in mechanisms like psychological targeting, understanding human behavior and influencing it, then the question is, how do we maximize the utility and the value for people while at the same time mitigating the risks that come with using some of these technologies? And when you look at different parts of the world, and Japan is actually one of the leading countries alongside the European Union or California when it comes to data protection regulation, there has been a lot of progress that's been made over the last decade or so when it comes to trying to protect people's rights to privacy and agency. Now, most of them, and this is where I think we have a lot more work to do, most of those regulation focus on the notion of transparency and control. So we need to explain to people what happens with their data, and then we need to give them the ability to control and manage it. And that's a very good starting point, because we need that for everything that's about to come after. But what I argue in the book, and where I've been thinking a lot in terms of how do we do better, is transparency and control in my book is not enough. And I've been starting to use this metaphor to illustrate why I don't think it's enough. And it's essentially comparing it to someone being put in charge of their own sailing boat. If you are the captain, if you are in charge of your own sailing boat when you're drifting along the Mediterranean Sea on a beautiful day, the weather is nice, the sea is calm, you can only make good choices because any town you might steer towards is going to be beautiful. If that's the environment that you're in, yes, then being in charge and being able to control and manage your data is great. But what I would argue is that that's not the environment that we're in. The environment that we're in looks much more like this. It's a raging thunderstorm where we are, as consumers, oftentimes are up against very powerful players that are not necessarily coming to the game with our best interest at heart. There's a million emergencies. We don't have the knowledge or the time to really manage our data responsibly. If you were to read all of the terms and conditions, try and figure out exactly how your data is being used or abused, that would be a full-time job. And most of us just don't have the knowledge or the time to do that. So in this world, suddenly transparency and control becomes much more of a responsibility than a right. And so the question is, how do we complement transparency and control with other systems? And if you follow this analogy, then I think there's two things that you would want to do. One is tame the sea, make it easier for people to do the right thing. That could mean privacy by design, where the default is your data is being protected. That could mean new forms of processing data where you don't have to collect all the data in a central spot, but you process locally so that people get the insight that they want. Google Maps, for example, getting from A to B without necessarily sharing the location data itself. And the last part, the competent crew, essentially is trying to see how can we create new forms of data governance that allow communities of people to get together and collectively organize the data to make the most of it and really kind of maximize the utility that they get from it. And this brings me back to the village, because when I grew up in this village, my parents actually owned small parcels of land where we grew wine. But we certainly didn't produce enough wine to, or like grapes to make our own wine. So what happens in this region is that people get together in wine co-ops. So we all pull our grapes together and then we sell them to bigger wineries. And what has been suggested in the data space is something very similar. It's the idea that if I want to manage my data alone, it's a full-time job and I don't have the expertise. If all of us pool our data together, not only can we get much better insights, but we can also get experts to help us. So my data, for example, is one of my favorite cases in the data co-op space, which looks at health data. So it's based in Switzerland, and it allows patients with a focus on people who suffer from multiple sclerosis to pool their health data to better understand what are the genetic drivers, the environmental drivers, the medical history drivers, the biomarkers that predict different symptoms, and how can we customize treatment for each and every patient. So it's a completely different way of thinking about data, where you have an entity that is legally obligated to act in the best interest of the customers and the people being part of that. So completely different way of making sure that the data and the insights that we can get from the data actually work for us and not against us. So this is a broad overview, a high-speed tour through the content of the book, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation from here.
Thank you very much for walking through your key point in your book with us. To connect Sandra's work with our own foundation, let me briefly outline the Human Information Database. It is a long-running platform that brings together about 50,000 participants, 20 plus researchers in psychology and neuroscience, and more than 30 client organizations. The goal is simple: create a stable, high-quality view of human attributes, cognitive patterns, and biases that can support real application in business and public policy. This is the context in which we see strong alignment with Sandra-san's approach, turning psychological insight into something operational and testable. Moving to the second part of our dialogue, generative AI for personalized persuasion at scale. Your recent paper shows that personalization is no longer constrained by human effort, with only short prompts and minimal input. Generative models can reliably produce messages that match psychological profiles. The evidence that these effects persist even with disclosure, and that they translate into real behavioral signals, is particularly striking. Sandra-san, would you walk us through the core ideas of this work and what you see as its broader implications?
I will talk about the findings of the paper and the idea in a second, but I thought that it might make sense to almost take a step back and talk about what I think of as the really remarkable ability of these generative AI models, large language models, the likes of ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, that you know of, which will then set the stage for the findings of the paper. So when I think of large language models, I think of them being trained for a very simple task. The task that they've been trained for is to fill in the blank, to predict the next element in a sequence of element, the next word in a sentence. And by doing so, what I would argue is that they have been trained to actually do a lot more than just model language. When we talk about large language models, we think of language, we think of grammar, we think of semantic meaning. But what I have been arguing, and I'm not alone, a lot of my colleagues have been arguing the same, is that in the process of being trained for this very, very simple task, they have actually internalized a lot about the world that we live in and our psychology. And I want to give you a few examples that I think nicely illustrate what I mean. So if I give a large language model the sentence, I left Seattle and after about 3 hours of driving north, I crossed the border with Canada. which sounds really simple because it's just the model is predicting the most likely next word. And because it's Canada, the most likely next word that it puts there is Canada. But if you think about it for a second, for the model to put Canada there, it actually needs to simulate something about our physical environment. I'm not necessarily suggesting that it fully understands geography, but it needs to model something about our physical space. Seattle is on the west coast of the United States, speed of driving, the closest border is probably Canada. So it, in a way, simulates something about our physical world. If you take a sentence like this, Japanese restaurants are known for their, and I really tried this, it did put sushi there. So for it to put this word there, which is probably also what I would have put there because I love sushi. But for it to put this word here, it actually needs to model something about our social context. It needs to model something about culture. In a way, it needs to, used very liberally, understand that the food that is being served in Japanese restaurants is different than the food that is being served in American restaurants. If you put American restaurant there, it gives you burger, fries. If you put Mexican restaurant there, it gives you tacos. So in a way, again, just by filling in this next word in a sentence, these large language models learn something about our social world. And you can take this a step further and give it a sentence like, Sam hates fish, but he still has to eat some. He probably feels disgusted. For the LLM to put the word disgusted there, it needs to simulate human emotion. It needs to simulate that if you eat something that you don't like, the emotional response that you have to that is disgust. Even more so, if you then say there's another person, Jane, who dislikes Sam. So seeing him having to eat the fish that he doesn't like makes her feel happy. That's the typical Schadenfreude. Someone else that you don't like has to do something that they hate. So you feel happy. That's a really complicated inference. That's like someone's second order emotion. Or John likes Sam, so he feels sad about this. So again, it's like just the next word in a sentence, but it tells us something about our inner psychological lives. And some of the latest research that has been conducted by a friend and colleague of mine, Michał Kosinski at the University of Stanford, really nicely illustrates this point even more. So what he did is he took a classic psychology experiment that goes as follows. So you imagine you are in a room that has a box, it has a cat, and it has a basket. Now also in the room are me and my husband. And so now my husband, he takes the cat and he puts it in the basket and then he leaves because he has to take care of the kid. While he is gone, I take the cat and I put it in the box. And then I leave. And last step is my husband actually comes back. So now there's two questions, and this is oftentimes done with kids and adults. So the two questions are, where is the cat? So you know that the last action that happened in the story was me putting the cat in the box. So the cat is currently in the box. The more interesting question is, where will Moran, my husband, look for the cat? And for most people, the answer is intuitive, it's instinctive, and it comes within a split second. The answer is, well, Moran wasn't there when I moved the cat to the box, so he will look for the cat naturally in the basket. Now, what is so intuitive to most of us is actually a really remarkable ability when you think about it. It's something that we call theory of mind. It's the fact that as we go through the world, we constantly simulate the reality from the perspective of other people. For you to know that Moran doesn't know the cat is in the box because he wasn't there, you have to simulate passively, automatically, his reality every step along the way. And again, it's so intuitive for us that we oftentimes forget how remarkable it is. He won't be able to solve any of these problems until he's around 3 to 4 years old. That's why kids are notoriously bad at lying, because they can't understand that your reality is different than theirs. Even then, they oftentimes make mistakes even after. Otherwise, extremely intelligent species like chimps, dolphins, can't solve these problems at all. So it's really a hallmark, this theory of mind and of human intelligence. And what is so interesting about this, and this is the work that Michał Kosinski has been doing, is because the experiment that I gave you is a story. It's a story about a box, cat, and a basket. We can pose the same question to a large language model. So he started with very early versions of ChatGPT. GPT-3 is even before ChatGPT came out. And he just gave it the story. So the story about the box, and asked it, where is the cat? So in 2020, the answer that the large language model gives is the cat is in the room, it's in the basket. So it doesn't even understand reality. So it doesn't get the sequence of actions right because it focuses on the last action, on the first action. Now, fast forward 2 years, the models get better, they are bigger, they're built based on more data, and you give it the same question, where's the cat? Now it says the cat is in the box. So 2022, the model gets reality right, but you ask it the question that is harder, where is Moran going to look for the cat? And it says in the box. That's your toddler. It's like, the model, know the cat is in the box. Why would Moran not know the cat is in the box? So it fails to simulate the reality of other people. However, fast forward another year, ChatGPT 4, which is much bigger, but it's still smaller, much smaller than the human brain. But you give it the question again, where's the cat? The cat is in the box, so reality right. Where's Moran going to look for the cat? And now it not only gets the answer right, it also explains why. So now it can actually simulate the thought process of Moran, saying, well, he's going to look for the basket because he wasn't there when Sandra put it in the box. So for me, and again, for other researchers as well, what this suggests is that LLMs are not just language models. They're incredibly powerful human simulation machines. And if you bring this back to the context of psychological targeting, it becomes very obvious how powerful that is. Because what it actually allows you to do is automate both stages of the process. The first one is take data and translate it into psychological insights. And the second one is take psychological insights and translate it into persuasive messages. And so what we know is that an off-the-shelf LLM, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, it doesn't matter. If you give access to someone's behavioral history, so their social media posts, their credit card spending, their browsing histories, and you just ask it, what do you think is the big 5 personality profile of that person? What do you think is their political leaning? It actually makes very accurate predictions of that person's psychology without ever having explicitly trained to do so. It's essentially because it's read the entire internet with all the narratives and all the stories that we have about ourselves, it just knows about psychology. And you can also, because these models are interactive, have these conversations with chatbots where the goal of the chatbot is to gauge who you are without explicitly mentioning this. And you can imagine that it increases accuracy by a lot because the model can ask directed questions, and it also knows the gaps in its knowledge. So it might already, based on your prior responses, have a good sense of whether you're more extroverted or introverted. It might not necessarily know if you're more neurotic or emotionally stable, but because it knows that it doesn't know, it can just ask new questions that increase its confidence in that score. So we know that these interactions are incredibly powerful for making these inferences. And one of the areas of research that we're currently looking into is essentially what LLMs do that was really hard to do before at scale, is finding the right level of signal to noise. Because what happened before is you either had these behavioral approaches, think of Amazon, which is essentially saying people who liked X also liked Y. So I take your entire behavioral history and based on your entire digital footprint, I predict what you're going to do next, or I try to customize a message. That's extremely noisy because you have many behaviors that are either not relevant, repetitive. So there was a lot of noise in that data. On the other side, what psychologists like myself were doing was almost like too extreme in how much signal it cut out. So we take this entire behavioral history and we force it into a profile that has 5 different scores. So you cut out some of the noise, but you also cut out a lot of signal. What these large language models can do is they can do something in between, which is how we oftentimes think about people. So a large language model can take your entire data history and turn it into a summary, like a free text summary of, let's say, 20 bullet points, talking about how Sandra's digital footprints suggest that she really cares about her family because she oftentimes mentions her son. She also really cares about her friends. She seems intellectually curious because she's talking about science. So instead of having all of the data in the world or a 5-score numeric profile, you can have idiosyncratic summaries that optimize signal to noise ratio. And that's how we think about other people. We don't think about them in terms of specific behaviors, and we also don't think about them in terms of a very structured profile. We think about them in terms of these unique mental models of the world. So this is incredibly powerful because LLMs can now do this at a much larger scale. And then the second part is that obviously AI can also generate content that is customized. So some of the work in the paper that was mentioned looks at some of these personality traits. And this is a very simple example. You can ask ChatGPT, write me a short ad for an iPhone that speaks to a person who scores high on the personality traits of openness and extroversion. You don't even need to specify what those traits mean, what they are, because it knows. And within seconds, you get an ad that is, first of all, customized. So when you look at it as a psychologist, you can clearly see that it speaks to the dimensions of extroversion and openness. And what we've tested in the paper is that essentially once an LLM customizes to people's personality, the message becomes more persuasive. So people think of the message as more effective. And they also say that they would be more likely to spend money on buying an iPhone, supporting a political candidate, and so on. So it is also effective at influencing behavior. And obviously, this was just the beginning. When we talk about text, these models have become much, much better at generating both images and video. So you could imagine that soon you could have a fully automated pipeline that goes from your data, infers who you are, what your needs are, and then creates on-the-fly content that is matched to these personas. So to me, this is really at the beginning of a very different world where some of the benefits that we talked about, but also some of the challenges, some of the ethical challenges are just put on steroids and amplified.
Let me briefly summarize what we have learned so far. From MINDMASTERS, we see that digital behavior reveals stable psychological traits, and that these traits meaningfully shape how people interpret messages. From your latest paper, we see the next step. Generative AI makes it possible to apply these insights at scale. With minimal input, AI can generate messages aligned with personality traits. And those messages consistently increase relevance and willingness to pay. In short, this is a bridge between psychology and execution, moving from understanding people to influencing outcomes in a measurable and repeatable way. In the old paradigm, we leveraged big data to target customers based purely on statistical correlations, which were often a black box that humans could not interpret. On the other hand, in the new paradigm, big data is classified through the lens of personality. That means it's no longer a black box. Humans can actually the underlying individual traits and use them for targeting. As a result, you can build a feedback loop between personality classification and targeting activities. It also makes a human review much easier when generating content with AI. This paradigm shift gives us clues not just about correlations, but without underlying causality as well. Sandra, with this comparison in mind, would you value your thought on how human information database can evolve toward this real-time, profile-driven model?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right in how you think about this. It very much mirrors how we as humans make judgments and form impressions about other people. The first time that you meet someone, you are probably going to fall back on some of these broad dimensions. The first time that you meet someone, having access to, say, their Big Five personality profile gives you a sense of how they might behave. Knowing that they're a bit more outgoing gives you a sense of which activities they might enjoy or how you should be talking to them. But what we humans do constantly is update our beliefs. We observe how do they respond to the topic that we bring up? How do they respond to me taking them to the movie? How do they enjoy the restaurant that I take them to? So as humans, we constantly update the mental models that we have of the people that we talk to. And so far, in the world of psychological targeting, our profiles have been relatively static. We just take someone's history, we make a prediction, but that prediction rarely gets updated in real time, and even more rarely gets adjusted to the current situation. And what you can do with these more dynamic feedback loops is not just say, well, I'm updating my beliefs about who you are. It's also that you can say, well, I understand that generally speaking, my husband, for example, is more extroverted, but there's certainly situations where that might not be the case. If he is sitting at home working, he probably feels more introverted. So in this situation, targeting him with an extroverted ad might not actually be the most effective because that's not the state that he's currently in. So the more we can integrate both feedback loops and more dynamic data on what people currently do and the situations, the context that they're in, the more fine-grained and nuanced the understanding of what they might need, what they might want can actually be. So I very much agree that that's what we should be aiming for, and it's just oftentimes not very easy to do. So I'm happy that someone is working on this.
Even with more data and more channels, we will face the same outcome. Behavior rarely changes. The reason is simple. Most interventions are built for broad segment, not for the individual. People do not feel the message is about them. So the intention never converts into action. This gap between statistical averages and true personalization is exactly where Sandra-san's approach offers a breakthrough. This framework reminds us that behavior change is never a single step. People move through stages from not feeling the need to understanding the need to acting to sustaining the action. The challenge is that each stage requires a different psychological approach. If we add the COM-B model, the picture becomes even clearer. Behavior breaks down for different reasons: capability, motivation, or opportunity. These barriers change as people move through stages. One key reason behavior change fails is that we tend to provide information at only one stage in a uniform way. The message is not personalized, and it arrives at the wrong moment. This is why broad one-size-fits-all communication does not work. What matters is persuasion across every stage. Only individualized communication tailored to the right advice at the right stage can realistically move someone forward. By and large, This slide shows how personalization can move beyond messages into stories. We came across new business ideas building upon your book and papers. We have brought together 3 strengths as below. First is Human Information Database, NTT Data IOMC has. And the second is the Narrative Generation Technologies, NTT R&D, that tailored to Japanese content. And thirdly, Fortense has the real-world experiences of changing users' behaviors. I would like to call this personalized story persuasion. The idea is not to optimize persuasions in a narrow sense, but to support behavior change over time. We start from diverse data signals, including interactive and episodic data, categorize them into psychologically meaningful profiles, such as the Big 5 traits. Generative AI then turns these profiles into narratives that resonate with where a person is today. Most importantly, these stories are matched to the individual's stage of behavior change, from awareness to action to maintenance, and refined through repeated interaction. This is how personalization becomes guidance, not pressure, and why storytelling plays such a central role in this approach. Now, shall we move to the part 3 of our dialogue? We would also like to highlight digital therapeutics as an example of the positive impact that psychological fit can have in our lives. In Japan, digital therapeutics is still at an early stage. Only a small number of products have reached the market, and most activity is concentrated in startups. Yet the potential is clear. Many of the top diseases areas, such as diabetes, depression, chronic pain, require sustained behavior change, not just medication. We also see new approaches emerging beyond traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, digitalized lifestyle therapies, neurofeedback, and even therapeutic games. This is precisely where psychological personalization can make digital therapeutics more effective and more engaging. Let me introduce a little bit about our initiatives in Japan. DTX delivered through mobile applications enable patients to continue their daily treatment, such as medications, more easily and consistently, while receiving support that is optimized to their individual symptoms and daily routines. What we need are common, industry-wide workflows for contracting, prescribing, billing, and usage. And we need an environment where DTX can operate independently of each hospital's IT constraints. Together with pharmaceutical industry companies, we are developing the platform where the clinical and behavioral benefit of DTX can scale far more quickly. In mental health, the opportunity is large, but so are the risks. Your book highlights both sides. AI can detect early signs of depression. Yet poorly governed systems have delivered harmful advice to people in crisis. From our perspectives, this raises a crucial question. If personalization becomes part of DTX, what concrete ethical and regulatory standards must be in place to protect vulnerable users. サンドラさん、we would appreciate your views on the safeguards that should be considered from the start.
It was a pleasure listening to you outlining the framework and the way that you're thinking about it, because it very much resonated with me on the level that I think when most people think about data and they think about AI, they think about technology, which makes sense because that is oftentimes the discipline, the academic discipline, scientific discipline, where a lot of this technology is developed. But for me, and this is what I heard you speaking about as well, it's something that is fundamentally human. What you described in terms of trying to understand where someone is coming from and then personalizing the journey according to that person's need and motivation is something that we do as humans all the time. If you think about it, we don't talk to a 3-year-old the same way that we talk to our best friend, the same that we talk to our boss at work. We are so attuned to who's on the other side that, again, oftentimes we don't even notice it. So what I liked about the way that you described it is it very much focuses on the human side, and it brings out the potential benefit rather than for humans, for individuals, rather than just thinking about it as the next technological gadget. And so the DTX example that you mentioned, I think, is a very powerful one where you can immediately see the benefit. And it's so powerful because it's a space where people oftentimes have the best intentions. We all want to exercise more. We all want to eat more healthily. We all want to take our medication. We all have the best intentions to working out on our mental health and making sure that we're physically and mentally fit. And yet life throws barriers at us and makes it difficult in many ways. And so we oftentimes need support, whether that comes from like an in-person family member or loved one, or whether that is increasingly technology. And so I think that the reason for why this example is so good is because it's a space where technology is used to help you accomplish a goal that you're trying to accomplish anyway, and you're just having a hard time doing it. And so when you talk about the ethical challenges, the question is, how do you protect it against abuse? So I think the mental health space is such a good one because we do have examples from the past that highlight both sides. So as I mentioned, and you have this on the slides, is we can detect early signs of depression, anxiety, emotional distress from online signals. That is true for stuff that we post on social media. That is true when you look at your smartphone sensing data. If you're based on your GPS records, we can see that you're not leaving the house as much anymore. You're not making or taking as many calls. You're not interacting with people as much. It could be nothing, right? It could be that you're just on vacation and having a good time, but it's an early warning system. And so we know that in 2015, for example, Facebook was accused of using some of these insights on teenagers, so predicting whether teenagers were suffering from low self-esteem, anxiety, as a way to sell them out to advertisers. And so that's a clear violation of people's trust and their privacy and their right to essentially take care of their mental health. But you could also imagine, if you take it in a different context, that it's an incredibly powerful tool. I was recently talking to a young mother, or a mother whose son had tried to commit suicide. And what she said is all she needed was some kind of early warning system because the son wasn't talking to her. So if there had been something like a smoke alarm that had said, hey, maybe it's nothing, and it's not a diagnostic tool. We're not telling you that your son is currently depressed, but their behavior seems to be deviating from their typical norm. So maybe try and figure out what might be going on. She said, like, this would have completely changed the entire experience. So in this case, it's helping people get better. And so when you talk about these regulatory frameworks, or even more so, I think of it oftentimes in the context of technology, is what you want is much more control over who gets access to the data and who gets to make those predictions. And then also, ideally, and doing it in a way that you don't have to give that data in the first place. So when you think of the medical space, for example, this is true for mental health, this is true for other diseases, medical data is oftentimes extremely sensitive, right? So when you take genetic data, you take medical histories, extremely valuable to understand disease and help you become better, get the right treatment at the right time, but also extremely sensitive. So the moment that this data is out there, you share it with a hospital system, you share it with an insurance provider, you don't know what's going to happen with the data. And most often it's the companies benefiting and not you. So there's these new types of machine intelligence, which essentially give you the same insights without you having to share the data itself. It's something that we call federated learning, and it makes use of the fact that we all have supercomputers at home. The processing power of your phone is 1,000,000 times higher than the processing power of the computers that we used to launch the Challenger rocket into space a few decades ago. So you have incredibly powerful machines at home. And now what we can do is, instead of me having to send my entire genetic data or my entire medical history to a hospital system or an insurance provider or some kind of technology company that is trying to help me get the right treatment, what we can do is they can ask for intelligence from my phone. So they can send the models to create this intelligence and the insights to my phone, where it gets locally updated. And it kind of gives me the same insights, but I don't have to share my data. It's, for example, how Siri gets trained on an iPhone. So Apple doesn't need to take all of your speech data to process it locally. What they do is they keep all of your speech data on the phone. They send their speech recognition model to your phone. It learns, it gets better at understanding your voice, at responding, and then it shares back the insights. The same is true for the medical space. And so for me, it's really one of these instances where I think it's regulation in combination with technology that's going to make a real difference when it comes to protecting people's privacy and preventing the abuse.
Thank you. And finally, Sandra-san, may I ask for a short message and advice to our Japanese audience?
So hopefully, based on the conversation, what you've taken away is that a lot of the data that we generate is much more intimate than we think, and oftentimes realize. And one of the messages that I always hope my students take away, for example, when I teach my MBA and executive MBA classes, is that it is worth fighting for our privacy, because oftentimes, especially with the younger generation, there's people who come to me and say, well, I don't care about my privacy, I have nothing to hide. And I think it's a very short-sighted gamble, just because we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. You might feel safe sharing your data right now, not understanding that you could be hurt tomorrow. It is also a privileged position, because not everybody feels comfortable sharing their data. So collectively, I think we should be standing up for our right to manage data and support initiatives like the ones that you've just heard that actually make sure that we can use data to our benefit, but in a way, in a system that is actually designed to protect our privacy and our ability to control what is happening with the data and how it benefits us.
So thank you very much for this thoughtful discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the entire team at NTT.